just as there's an obligatory and an optional sort of prayer, so also there is an obligatory and optional sort of charity for Muslims. The Quran frequently enjoins believers to give something it calls sadaqah, which just means charity, really. Giving alms in a generic sense, recommending that they be dished out, preferably in secret. But it also requires more formally the payment of this thing called zakat. And quite often you find the Quran combining the injunction to these two practices, the salat and the zakat. Often they are side by side. The word zakat in Arabic means purity, has that sense. And a number of hadiths indicate that one's money and wealth are not considered pure for one's own use unless a certain percentage has been dished out to the deserving. But the word zakat also means growth. Even in modern Arabic, the root can mean growth, referring, it seems, to the Prophet's insistence that no wealth ever diminished through charity. In other words, if you give, God will give you more. Now, the hadith, as incorporated into subsequent codifications of the religion, indicates that the basic rate for zakat is 2.5%. The original language, 1 sheep in every 40. And this is payable not on earnings or on income, but on wealth. In other words, at the end of each year, every Muslim is obliged to calculate the value of whatever assets he or she owns and pay a 40th to charity. There are some assets that are considered exempt. For instance, if you own a house that's for your own use, no zakat is payable. However, if you own extra houses that you're renting out, then you have to pay up on the value of those houses. On some categories, such as some crops, and precious metals and precious stones, the rate actually goes up to 10%. Who actually receives the zakat? This is listed definitively in a Quranic verse, which is Surah 9, verse 60, where you'll see that there are 8 deserving categories. And these are those who are poor, those who are otherwise needy, those whose hearts are to be reconciled, which seems to mean money for missionary or diplomatic activities, liberation of slaves, discharge of debtors, support for people who are fighting in defence of the community, support for travellers, particularly those who are out of funds in foreign parts, and finally those who actually work to collect the zakat. Despite the implications of that verse, the actual process of donation has generally been left to the individual rather than administered by the state. Today in the Muslim world, you find that some governments are experimenting with ways of collecting it simply by adding it to the income tax. On the form you indicate your zakatable wealth and you cough up accordingly. However, given the famous inefficiency of a lot of the state bureaucracies, generally this innovation has not proved terribly popular. There's also the added complication that zakat in an Islamic state is only payable by Muslims. So a state that has a mixed population is going to have to differentiate between Muslim citizens and non-Muslim citizens. That makes it administratively more difficult, especially if there's a mixed marriage, for instance. In some states, however, Malaysia in particular, I think, there are workable zakat taxation systems in place. The disbursement of funds is made through government offices, a bit like social security offices. In general, however, for most Muslims, and overwhelmingly for Muslims in the West, zakat is a private affair. There are a few majority non-Muslim countries where zakat is centrally collected by the state, Singapore, for instance, but generally this isn't done. I think in some European countries like Scandinavia, the government does allow Muslims the option of paying zakat to the state, and the state will then disperse it to recognise Muslim charities. The sum's raised because this is a tax on wealth rather than on income, and hence militates against the accumulation of capital and wealth, which was one of the things the Prophet was originally preaching against in Mecca. Sums accumulated can be quite considerable. The Sultan of Brunei, for instance, is estimated to have a liability of $600 million a year in zakat payments. In Britain, the total amount of zakat payable has been estimated at about £500 million, most of which goes as remittances to poor relatives back in Pakistan, which is a legitimate use of zakat, or to the various Muslim charities that are now in this country and elsewhere springing up very fast. Quite often you find in Britain and America that mosques have their own zakat funds to which needy individuals in the local community can apply. It's generally considered more meritorious if zakat goes to needy members of the local community rather than being sent abroad. In practice, however, particularly in Britain, where whole families migrated, the existence of the extended family system with its own informal welfare arrangements means that there are very few Muslims in Europe who are actually destitute. You see down and outs on the streets of London who are white or of West Indian ancestry, but almost never will you see somebody who is of Arab or Asian appearance. That I think is all I'm going to say about the zakat. It's fairly self-explanatory.